Could this be the best new method to smoke your ribs? In this video, I'm testing out the Goldee's no wrap till the end rib method, and we're gonna see how it turns out, so let's get smoking. I was watching an episode of Behind the Food TV where Al visits one of the top barbecue restaurants in Texas called Goldee's Barbecue. And they teach him their rib method where they go unwrapped at 275 for 5 hours, then they wrap in foil with a glaze and they let the ribs rest for a few hours. I'll link that video in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe to Al. You basically have to if you're serious about barbecue and you want to learn all about how the pros are doing it. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, Steve, wouldn't cooking the ribs totally unwrap the entire cook, dry them the F out? Well, yes, but that's kind of the point. When you smoke ribs unwrapped at 275 for 5 hours unwrapped, two things are happening. First, evaporation drives off most surface moisture, which really allows the temperature to increase past the boiling point. That means that the Maillard reaction really kicks in. That's the reaction between amino acids and sugars that forms a golden crust on a steak or a good sear on a burger. Second, the higher temperature means that the surface fat on the ribs is basically frying in its own fat and rendering down into ooey gooey goodness. You just don't get that kind of texture when you wrap because foil or butcher paper keeps the moisture at the surface of the ribs and prevents them from ever getting above 212 degrees, which is the boiling point of water. So Goldee's maximizes the bark and texture of the ribs, which yes, that is going to dry them out, but then they rehydrate them by wrapping them and resting them with a liquid glaze. Now that sounds really good, it's easy to explain, and it makes sense, and Goldee's is a top Texas barbecue joint for a reason. But they're using super thick, high quality Duroc pork ribs. They're cooking in a very humid environment. They're leaning on years of experience. There's a lot of variables. And the question in my mind is, will this work for just a regular backyard cook who is buying some cheap Costco ribs? To find out, I'm lining up 6 racks of spare ribs and leaving the membrane on because that's what the method calls for. We'll be doing a couple of thicker and thinner racks the Goldee's way. Again, I'll be doing some the traditional 3-2-1 method where we wrap with foil partway through. Now, we're just testing a method in this video. Presumably, the method should work with any barbecue rub, so I'm going to use the stuff I always use for ribs. I'm seasoning the backs of the ribs with Smoke Trails BBQ Let's Go general purpose BBQ rub, and then I'm doing a final layer with Smoke Trails BBQ brisket rub, all of which are available and linked below so you can try them out. Then I'm flipping them over and I'm repeating on the top. Pretty looking ribs. Now let's pop smoke and light up my 250-gallon offset with some cherry wood, just giving it a blast with a torch to fire it up. I decided to use this guy today because cooking a ton of ribs with it is a lot easier because it's huge. We're gonna run this guy at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 hours unwrapped because that's what the method calls for. After 3 hours, I'm removing the 3-2-1 ribs and wrapping them in foil with some butter, then putting them back on the smoker. And around an hour and a half later, they were super tender, so I unwrapped them and I sauced them with my version of the Goldee's Glaze, which I'll put in the description section below. Not an exact copycat recipe, but it's got all of the kind of right ratios in it at least. 5 hours in, the Goldee's ribs look like this, nice bark, and we're getting some sizzle on top of the ribs. They're bending nicely, so I'm wrapping them meat side down with a healthy amount of glaze so they can suck up that moisture, and I'll let them rest for 2 hours. And here they are on the cutting board. 2 Goldee's on the left looking sparkly and moist, but the bark isn't washed out. And the 3-2-1 ribs on the right with the sauce tacked up. I like the look of the Goldee's ones better, honestly. All right, so let's start off with the Goldee's method ribs. These were the thicker cut of ribs that I cooked, and they've been resting for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half now. I'm gonna do a big double rib here, and I'll give you guys a close-up first of the bark. So the bark was looking really nice when it came off the smoker. It did dissolve a little bit after we added that glaze and rested it in the liquid, but it's looking pretty juicy. Not bad at all. It doesn't look dry. Pretty good. The membrane is a little bit rubbery. If you look at it, I peel it off and I mean, you can barely tear it apart. Other than that, really good rib. The only thing I'd say is you can see there's quite a bit of fat there and we didn't really render it all the way. So I think if I could go back in time, I was running out of time a little bit in this cook, I would have taken them a bit more and rendered that fat a little bit more on the ribs and seen if we could get a little bit more sizzle, but that's for next time. But if you look at the very edges, it does look really well done. And that tastes really good. So I'm gonna take another edge piece here, and this is where the fat got really well rendered, and that just tastes 1,000 times better. But a little bit more dry, a little bit more jerky-like, but the fat rendering makes up for it. Okay, let's move on to the second rack of Goldee's ribs. These are the thinner rack of ribs. Again, I'll do a double rib here. And I'll give you guys a look. Really nice bark. Looks pretty decently juicy. Let's give it a bite here. Again, I don't know if I'm a huge fan of the membrane. You can just tear it right off and it's not fully rendered. So I don't know if I really like that, not removing the membrane part of it. And the rib tastes drier, which is unsurprising. It's a thinner rib. Let's take a piece from the very end here. Oh, that's inedible. Can't even eat that. Okay, so the method didn't really work that well on the thinner ribs. I kind of suspected that it might not. Thinner ribs just tend to be a little bit leaner as well, and they get drier a lot faster, so that's kind of unsurprising. Let's move on to the 3-2-1 ribs. They weren't really 3-2-1, but I did follow the method of unwrapped for X amount of hours and then wrapped and then unwrapped at the very end. That's some nice texture from the last hour where we allowed the sauce to glaze up. I just used the glaze that we used on the Goldee's ribs for this, and it tacked up really nicely. You can see that it is a lot juicier, I think. Maybe a little bit juicier than the Goldee's ribs. Let's take a bite of this. It's definitely juicier. It just doesn't have that fat rendering that the Goldee's ribs had, which added a ton of flavor. And maybe a little bit less smoke flavor, but I think the main benefit of the Goldee's method is the fat rendering. That really adds a ton of flavor. These are juicier though. Okay, and as I was cutting this, here's the thicker end of the Goldee's ribs. Man. That is amazing. I hit a fat pocket that was just really well rendered, and it is absolutely delicious. Here's another look at the thicker end of that rack. So the thicker end and the fattier end is way better than that thinner end I started tasting from. I'm gonna test out 2 more racks here because I often find that sometimes when you do these experiments, it just depends on the ribs, and some of the ribs are really thin, some of them are really thick, and some of them have a lot of fat in them. So that's why I wanted to do 2 sets of each experiment. I guess we could kind of dump some of this on it. Oh yeah. There we go. Okay, so let's start with the thickest part of the thickest rib here, right around here. Do a big double. This is almost like pork belly here. This is so thick. That is crazy thick. And it smells different too, that rendered fat. Oh, damn, that is good. Wow, that fat is so well rendered. Smoke flavor, bark, that's amazing. Now moving on to the thinner end of this rack, inedible. Moving on to the thinner ribs, I'll go to the very last rib. I'll just cut this last tip off, inedible. This rack is kind of weird. Let's go to the thickest part of this thin rack here. Okay, so this is probably the thickest part of that little thin rack. You can see how thin this is. It's got some good bites to it, but in general, it's kind of dry. I don't really like it that much. This rack, on the other hand, is crazy good. And you can see that even on this rack that tasted really good, there are some thinner parts to it. There's some thicker parts to it. And you can see how, I'm gonna give you guys a close-up here. You can see how you can just poke your finger right through there. Look at that. Like, it's so well rendered, and you wouldn't get that level of rendering if you wrapped your ribs. You have to have it exposed to that high heat convection of an offset smoker that kind of air fries the top of it. Oh, that is so good. Conclusions from this video. Does the Goldee's rib method work? Yes, it does if you're looking for a very particular texture and flavor on your ribs. I wouldn't recommend using it if you have really thin ribs. The thin ribs that I used were partially inedible and very dry, even in the thicker sections of those thin ribs. The thicker, fattier ribs were absolutely amazing. Some of the thinner sections of those fattier ribs were a little bit dry and probably inedible on the tips and the edges, and the thinner sections were a little bit too dry for my tastes. The 3-2-1 ribs, or the wrapped ribs that I did, were much better in my opinion than those sections, but the thicker sections of those fat ribs were absolutely phenomenal. There was perfect fat rendering on the top of the ribs and all the way through. It was almost like biting through perfectly rendered pork belly. So I could definitely see how if you have thicker ribs, more intramuscular marbling on them, they're fattier. I know that Goldee's uses Duroc pork, and that is probably one of the reasons that they're able to get away with using this method and have it turn out consistently good. All that extra rendering you get from not wrapping the ribs until the very end just creates this phenomenal flavor that probably makes them the best ribs that you can make if you get thick ribs and they have a lot of fat in them. If you have thinner, leaner ribs, I would not do this method. I would stick to something that involves wrapping it. But what do you guys think? Will you try the Goldee's method at home? If you do, let me know your experience in the comments below. And if you do test it out, let me know if you agree with my conclusion in this video that it probably only works really well on thicker and fattier cuts of ribs and not so well on thinner ribs. And as always, if you have ideas for future experiments you'd like to see on the channel, let me know in the comment section below. Happy smoking.